Meadows to 360.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so tell us about your background and how you came to be Professor Michael Meadows.
Well, the professor tag it really is a tag, and I guess it's come about over a number of years working in academia. I started in academia in the late 80s, in 1987, when I first started working as a journalist in residence at the University of Queensland, and after that I really got a taste for teaching. Particularly I love teaching and research, and that really convinced me that my future career was out of journalism and into academia, where I still am.
Research expertise areas includes the media representation of Indigenous affairs. Tell us how you got involved with this area of study.
I guess it started when I started to observe the treatment of Indigenous people just around Brisbane when I was a student here, seeing people, beaten up by police and being no obvious reason as to why this was happening. And I guess I became concerned about it, and that's when I actually switched to doing journalism at university, thinking, I've got to make a difference here. So I really started journalism with the idea of changing the world. I think a lot of young journalists do that. It's great, I think, to have those kind of ideals, but pretty quickly you realise that, it's pretty hard to turn a super tanker around, but you have to push the boundaries, and I think that's what I learned very quickly, that you don't go in, with a bulldozer and try to knock the barricades down. You have to be much more subtle and think about ways in which you can push the boundaries if that's what you want to do. And I think that's a philosophy that I've used in teaching as well. I think it's okay to, when you're working within a system, you have to work within it to change it, and hopefully change it for the better. And media generally are very poor at dealing with issues that are really step outside a white Anglo-Celtic culture. We don't see images of people other than white familiar faces in something like the Courier Mail. There's a segment called Time and Place, which the Courier Mail runs each day, and you'd be hard pressed to see anything other than a white face in that, if you look at it week after week after week. And that doesn't reflect the multicultural nature of Brisbane or of Australian society. So I think newspapers do have a role to play in reflecting society. And you only have to go to southern Brisbane, to Logan City, where I live, to see this huge multicultural diversity that exists, and media don't reflect that, mainstream media. That's why I think community media is so important, because community and alternative media are places where cultural diversity is reflected. In fact, they are the only places that seem to accurately reflect Australia's cultural diversity. And that comes out of a national study that I did with some colleagues here from Griffith University. We talked to audiences all around Australia, and they told us that community media for them was the only way in which Australian culture was being accurately represented. The mainstream really are about making money, essentially, and even public broadcasters like the ABC and SBS, to an extent driven by ratings. They get funded from governments, and if they're not pulling in audiences, they have to answer questions around that. And they follow the commercial media to some extent as well. So there is this kind of roundabout of chasing the same audiences. Unfortunately, it's the diverse audiences that are represented in Australian society are not being represented on Australian media. Indigenous Australians and history around Indigenous white relations in Australia are still, they're not taught to the extent that I think they should be. And people say, well, that's a black armband view of history. Why should we dwell on that? Why don't we move on? I think the simple answer to that is, if you look around and see the state in which many Indigenous people are still living in Australia, that's the very reason why we have to address that question, because until we can address the past, we can't begin to address the issues that are confronting us right now, and to look into the future to improve the situation for Indigenous people in Australia. I mean, the vast majority of Indigenous people here are still suffering the kinds of things that people in developing countries are suffering, and we call ourselves a developed country. Well, until we can deal with some of those problems, I think we can't really hold our heads up as high as we'd like to.